fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the Black community in Ottawa has to offer, and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
Good morning and welcome to our first session in our course, What History Left Out Part 2, African World History from 711 CE. I meant to change that, probably go back a little bit further, we'll do some overlap with our last course to 1896. I'm Dr. Clyde Ledbetter Jr. This course is brought to you by Jacques Cucambet in collaboration with BIA Media here in Ottawa. And as you saw from the promo, this is the spot where you can come to get all your media needs met. If you're into podcasting, if you're into radio production, TV shows, photography, anything you need for your event, for your organization, contact BIA Media right here at 235 Montreal Road. So what are we doing here? So if you're new to our courses, and I do this introduction every time we start a new course, how our format works. So our sessions are recorded. So if you ever miss a session, you'll have access to the recordings. I lecture for about 25 minutes. Then we take a recorded Q&A. Then I lecture for another 25, 30 minutes. And then we have open discussion at the end. Some of that open discussion is recorded. Then we turn the recording off and have more open discussion. So if you don't want to be recorded, save your questions to the very end and they won't be recorded, or your comments and they won't be recorded. But everything up until that point is recorded. So always remember that, and will be shared on various platforms, social media, YouTube, so we can get this information out to as many people as possible. And as always, if you ever miss a lecture, we have our course website where you can get all the recordings from previous lectures that we've done, as well as the course materials, readings, videos, different things, primary sources associated with the information that we're going to talk about today. So this is the fourth or fifth time that we've run this course. So this series of courses, the Sankofa African History courses, community courses, have been running since 2018. So we're entering our fifth year, and we're going to try to stay as consistent as possible to provide you this information always for free. There's no charge for any of this, no charge for lectures, no charge for the course website. All we ask is if it's on your heart, if you want to donate, you can feel free to donate. That money goes toward providing materials for youth, textbooks for youth, as well as funds to support our teaching assistants when we have those. We have the Coppin African Teachers Institute, where we teach young people, high school students and college students, the art and science of teaching African world history. And in fact, one of the alumni of that program, Miss Nana Bowen, is on as the TA for today. As those of you who are regulars, you know, Daniel's the permanent TA, but he's not here today. And we have a great fill-in. This is a student who's about to graduate from the University of Ottawa. She is an emerging expert in the fields of theology, African history, social justice, a very prominent rising scholar who will be going to graduate school somewhere very soon. So I'm glad that she's on. She's the one letting you in, so you can feel free to thank Nana when you can in the chat. So as we go through these lectures, you can write questions in the chat, you can make comments in the chat, and you can also raise your hand to ask questions when we have the Q&A. And I won't be addressing the chat until we stop, so just keep that in mind. All right, let's get right into it. So it's January, today is the 14th. Tomorrow is January 15th, which is actually the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr., which is really important for us as African people. It's one of our great icons. But this is what they're doing in Philadelphia and a lot of places around the United States for Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, which is the national holiday, which is falls on Monday. They have these things called Martin Luther King Days of Service, and this is a current picture from the Philadelphia Tribune, and you see it's Black family and they're picking up trash in their community. And there's a lot of events like this where people go paint schools and pick up trash and do different things to honor the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. Now, this is cool, but we really got to step back as African people, as students of history, and say, is this really the best way to honor Martin Luther King Jr., the revolutionary, the nonviolent revolutionary, the theologian, the activist? Dr. King would love to see beautiful neighborhoods like we all would, and this is, great work, but Dr. King's legacy is more about action. Dr. King's legacy is more about confronting injustice, confronting exploitation. And it's important for us to remember that, so we actually use his day to do those things. Because there's a lot of injustice still in the world. There's a lot of liberation that still needs to be accomplished. And King would want us to do that. And in fact, this goes to what we're talking about with these courses, which is the use of history as a tool for liberation. This is what Walter Rodney reminded us about back in 1968, not long after King was assassinated. If we truly know history and we truly use it for what it's meant to be used for African people, for liberation, then we would know King probably wouldn't want us doing this, at least not on his birthday. He probably would want us doing something else. So it's incumbent upon us to really investigate King's history and the history of so many of our great people and events and movements, because if not, we'll have a generation come up to think Dr. King was a janitor, that Dr. King was somebody that all he cared about was cleaning up communities. And that's not it. We can't let our history be watered down. We can't let our history be told to us in a way that takes the teeth out of our heroes. So I want to talk a little bit about King before we get started into the material that we're talking about today. And it all connects. One of the things that our enemies of Black progress have done with King is that they've rendered him to the I Have a Dream speech. And this is what all people know. This is what people know about King. You ask any young person on the street about Dr. King, they say, oh, it's the I Have a Dream. And then even with that, it's not even the whole speech. It's just the end part of the speech. But King wrote several books, and probably his most important text is the last one he wrote, Where Do We Go From Here? Community to Chaos, which was published a year before he was assassinated in 1967. And King presents himself a little different than how the media and mainstream propaganda presents King. King said this, and this is really important for us in 2023. A second important step that the Negro must take is to work passionately for group identity. This does not mean group isolation or group exclusivity. It means the kind of group consciousness that Negroes need in order to participate more meaningfully at all levels of life in our nation. Group unity necessarily involves group trust and reconciliation. One of the most serious effects of the Negro's damaged ego has been his frequent loss of respect for himself and for other Negroes. He ends up with a kind of ambivalence toward his own kind. To overcome this tragic conflict, it will be necessary for the Negro to find a new self-image. And this is what we're doing in this class. We're using history for that reconciliation that King is talking about, to promote group identity. Group identity among African people all over the world, because this history class goes all over the world. We have people that tune in from all over the world. We're broadcasting from Ottawa, but we bring in folks from all over the world to promote this group identity. And King practiced what he preached. So this was written in 1967, but even as far back as King's first emergence on the world scene, he was practicing this group unity. And it wasn't just with African Americans. King was an internationalist. King was, in some respects, a Pan-Africanist. We already talked in our last class, in our Shiro's class, about King's correspondence with the mother of the Angolan Revolution, Dolores Rodriguez, who corresponded with King when she was in Brazil. We also got this image here, where King is meeting with Tom Mboya, one of the nationalists from the Kenyan struggle. And this was all the way back in 1959. And you see King, you see Abernathy, King's, right-hand man in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I'm not sure who the other people are in this picture. That might be Benjamin Mays to the right of King, but I'm not 100% sure. But this is at the airport in Atlanta, where they're hosting Tom Mboya. And this is 1959. Kenya is still fighting for independence. King is right in the middle of the civil rights struggle, and they're uniting these struggles. And they had a African freedom breakfast where Tom Mboya spoke in Atlanta at Atlanta University, and King spoke as well. And then after this meeting, King wrote the Tom Mboya digitized King letters that you can find at Stanford University's website. So if you Google King letters, Stanford University, you can find a lot of King's correspondences with various African leaders, African activists, and international figures, as well as local figures in the struggle. But this is what King wrote to Tom Mboya. He said, "Thank you for your very kind comments concerning my book, Strive Toward Freedom," another one of King's books that everybody should read. This one was written about the experience of the Montgomery bus boycott. And this is, right after King becomes a national, international figure. This book is simply my humble attempt to bring moral and ethical principles to bear on the difficult problem of racial injustice which confronts our nation. I am happy to know that you found it helpful. I am absolutely convinced that there is no basic difference between colonialism and segregation. I'm gonna read that again because that's really important when we talk about that group unity. I am absolutely convinced that there is no basic difference between colonialism and segregation. They are both based on a contempt for life and a tragic doctrine of white supremacy. So our struggles are not only similar, they are in a real sense one. King connected the struggle of African Americans, of African Canadians, of Africans in Latin America, Africans in the Caribbean, with the struggles of Africans on the continent. He said, this is the same struggle. The struggle against colonialism, it's the same thing. This is what Malcolm X would say in 1964 when he went to Africa. And there's so many connections between Malcolm and Martin, but we'll explore those in April because we'll have a whole seminar on Malcolm X and Martin Luther King in April. So stay tuned for that. But I start with this because this is the King that I want you all to become more familiar with. The King that had his eye toward Africa, his eye, his heart, and his writing. He writes about Africa. He writes about the struggle in Algeria. He writes about the struggles in Kenya and different places on the continent. So this is the King that we should remember as we go into his birthday celebration this weekend. And Tom Mboya, another important figure, Kenyan nationalist. Neither one of these men would live to be 40 years old. They both were assassinated at the age of 39. King in 68, Tom Mboya in 69, but their legacies live on. As we know from African culture and African spirituality, death is not like the end of things. It's just a transition. And these men have become incredibly more powerful as ancestors. But it's incumbent on us to remember their true legacies and not let their missions be watered down to one speech or one idea about who these men were. So we're going to talk about Tom Mboya's homeland today because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about East Africa. And we're going to start our course differently than how we've started in the past. Usually when I start part 2 of our course in 7-11, I start in North Africa and I talk about the Moors entering Spain. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but I wanted to have more of an African conversation today before we start talking about African interactions with other people. We'll get into that a little bit at the end of the class today, but I really wanted to stay in Africa. So starting with Central and East Africa is a good place to start. So we'll talk about today the characteristics of life in the Bantu Swahili city-states. And then if we have time, we'll talk about the development of the African diaspora in Asia. So what exactly are we studying in this class? We're talking about African history for about 1,000 years, from around 800 to 1800, 1896 is where we'll stop. We'll stop at the Battle of Adwa, where the Ethiopians defeated the Italians. And this class is all about evidence. And everything we talk about in this class can be traced to some piece of primary evidence. I'm going to spend a lot of time over the next couple of weeks talking about evidence because it's so important for history. History is like, when you make historical claims, like making legal claims. you got to have evidence to back it up, or else you're just talking. And there's a lot of information out there now on YouTube, various places online where people talking about history, talk about different things, but they lack evidence. And they never tell you what their sources are, where they're getting this information from. We're not going to be like that in this class. I want you guys to be good students of African history and always ask the question, where is the evidence? How did the authors support the claims that they're making about African history? Because for a long time, the idea floating around academia, the idea floating around the world, particularly during slavery and at the decades and centuries after slavery ended, was that Africa had no history. And they presented very little evidence to back that up. But then African scholars and European scholars and Asian scholars said, no, let's look into this. And they started to rediscover the evidence for African history. So that's what we're going to do. What are we relying on in this class? Well, first, let me go back. If you want the information, this link will be shared with you. It will share with you in the registration email as well, where you can get all the information about the sources and documents and the pre-recorded lectures that we've had from this website, not only for this course, but all the other courses that we've run. Our evidence for these centuries that we're going to discuss over the next 7 weeks. Written evidence, of course, the written record. That's the first place people usually go. Well, did someone write about these events that we're talking about? So we have various sources of written record. We got, for the time period that we're in, we're not going to be dealing with a lot of Meta Neter, which is the ancient Egyptian script that the Greeks called hieroglyphics. It's not really for this class. That's for the previous class. And the Meroitic script we already talked about. Giz, Phoenician, Hebrew, Latin, Greek, and Arabic. Primarily Arabic and Greek, and African languages written in Arabic will be a lot of the written sources for the early period. As we go later on into the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, we'll get more English sources, French sources, Portuguese sources, Spanish sources, etc. But these are the written sources. Oral history is another key component of the evidence that we'll use to recreate these centuries. Many African nations, peoples, and ethnicities didn't write. And writing is not a marker of civilization, the way some European scholars had attempted to put it. They say, well, if people don't write, they're not civilized. No, writing is just something people use for administrative purposes. It's not a marker of intelligence. It's not a marker of civilization. We know the great lengths that African oral historians went to maintain, record, and pass along African history. And people like Jan Vasina and others, these are scholars, a scholar of Central Africa, have shown how we can reconstruct oral history to help us align or help us to better understand African history and align it with these other sources to get a more complete picture. So we could take the written history, we can check it against the oral history, and then we can use the archaeological record to back a lot of this stuff up. Written history can only go back so far. Oral history can only go back so far. But the good thing about these first two sources, they tell you a human story. They tell you about the emotions, they tell you about human interactions. And the more you get into this history, the more that you'll find that human beings, no matter how much we develop technologically, we're ultimately the same as we were as our ancestors thousands of years ago. The same motivations: love, jealousy, greed, desire for power, desire for justice. These things have been with us for centuries. And you see that in these records. But when we get to the archaeological record, it takes us back a lot further. But it doesn't tell us these stories in the same way as the oral and the written history. But it can tell us valuable information. It could tell us about social hierarchies in communities. It could tell us about the spread of technology, the spread of goods, the interactions between communities. It could tell us about social conflict. It could tell us about times of peace. It could tell us so many different things. So we rely on that. Linguistic evidence, botanical evidence. We can study the remains of plants. We can study genetically. Genetics has become a very important part of the reconstruction of African history. So we're bringing in all types of sciences: chemistry, biology, genealogy, which is not a physical science, genetics, even things like thermoluminescent studies, where we could take a clay pot and measure the amount of heat that's left. There's so many different things that we can do to reconstruct African history. So all this to say, and I know you might be thinking, why are we spending so much time talking about this? Because I want you all to be able to pick up a book, watch a video where someone's talking about history and say, oh, this person knows what they're talking about. They've presented their evidence. They've presented where they got the evidence and how it goes to reconstruct what they're talking about. So always look for the evidence. Always ask that question. All right. Let's move on. So what we're talking about today, we're going to talk about the Bantu migration, which is something that we started talking about in our part 1 of this course. This was the migration of African people from what's now Nigeria and Cameroon, all the way through the rainforest of Central Africa, down into Southern Africa, and ultimately into East Africa. This was a migration that started around, give or take, 3000 BCE, and kind of ended up in the period that we're talking about now. Very important, because this is the basis of the Swahili city-states on the East African coast. If you're following along in the textbook, this is a textbook that I recommend for this class. If you could get it off of Amazon. I don't know Kevin Shillington. I don't work for Kevin Shillington, but I can honestly say it's a good text. It's one that I used in university, and it's one that I recommend. And this is the current edition, the 4th edition, History of Africa by Kevin Shillington. It's on Amazon. It's probably about $30 or $40, but it's a nice general history textbook for Africa. And the information that we're talking about today comes from chapter 8. All right, so where we left off in class. In part 1, we talked about the rise of the kingdom of Aksum. We talked about its importance in this part of the world. We talked about when and Aksum is currently Ethiopia and Eritrea. When this kingdom controlled parts of Southern Arabia, we talked about that. We talked about the emergence of Islam and the role that the kingdom of Aksum played in that, around the time of the year of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, and the year of the elephant, and now one of the generals of the king of Aksum almost attacked the Kaaba during the year that Muhammad was born. We talked about all of that, and we talked about how once the Arabs received Islam and united, that kind of started to change things in this region. But there were things going on in Africa as well, and the Bantu migration was one of them. So all this is happening at the same time. And these East African states, which is what we'll focus on today, from Mogadishu down to Sofala in Mozambique, were affected by the Arabs uniting under Islam. So the Bantu people who came from this region of Africa, right around here, all the way down through the rainforest, down into South Africa, and ultimately into East Africa, bringing technology, bringing their culture, their language, their philosophy, interacting with the peoples that were already there. Very important human migration. You see another map representing that. So you see 3000 BC all the way up to 1100 AD or CE is when this migration was taking place. And you see the people that were already in these areas of Africa who the Bantu interacted with, who they exchanged ideas with. I'm spending so much time talking about the Bantu migration because it's really important for African people to know. And it's something that we rarely talk about as one of the most important events in African world history. From this migration, 500 languages have emerged. So many kingdoms and ethnicities, all with this root somewhere near Nigeria and Cameroon. From this area, they spread out to the rest of Africa. And what's magical about this migration, from the oral history, from the written history, from the archaeological record, we see a migration of mutual exchange and cooperation. It's not a story that's often told in human history. Usually when people migrate, there's violence, there's conquering, there's all types of man's inhumanity to man on display. But we don't see this with the Bantu migration. Now, talking about evidence. If evidence emerges, if there's some archaeological discovery somewhere in Angola, let's say, and then there's evidence of a widespread war of Bantu folks coming in with their iron weapons and just slaughtering the settlers, the people that were already on the land. Then we had to change the narrative. We had to say, well, the Bantu migration wasn't as cooperative and mutual as we thought, but that hasn't emerged yet. So what we know from the evidence is when this happened, African people exchanged ideas. When the Bantu interacted with the Batwa, the people of short stature throughout East and Central Africa, they exchanged ideas. They intermarried. They taught each other. The Twa taught them how to survive in the forest. The Bantu brought in farming techniques and iron technology. When they interacted with the Cushic people, the anthropologists call them Cushite people that were indigenous to the Great Lakes region, who were already engaged in cattle producing and millet farming and that type of thing. The Bantus exchanged technology and techniques with them and learned from them, which allowed them to expand further into East Africa and then further south down along the East African coast. So this is a beautiful migration to study. And one of the key modern scholars that studies this migration is Dr. Blair Rose Zaid. She's at the University of Nebraska. She might actually be at University of Michigan now, but she just got her PhD almost 4 years ago out of the Michigan State University. And her dissertation was called In Search of Homeland, Bantu Expansion as Pre-Modern African Diaspora. And I love her dissertation. I put a link to it on our course website because what she talks about is when the Bantu moved from their homeland in Nigeria, and this wasn't a continuous migration, it was fits and stops and going back and forth, but she said they maintained aspects of a common connection through their language, through their philosophy, through their culture, through the food they ate, through the pottery they created. We see this. It was a conscious historical remembrance of all of the various travels and experiences that they've been through on this trek. This is a beautiful dissertation. She is an archaeologist and anthropologist with a degree in African and African American studies. This is a scholar that you should definitely look out for. She also writes children's books as well. She's a multi-talented scholar. But yeah, she's contemporary, so you can look her up if you're interested in learning more about the Bantu migration. Once the Bantus entered the East African coast, they set up shop first as fisher people. So they mastered coastal fishing. Then they start interacting with folks coming from Madagascar. And then people coming from India and Indonesia, various sailors that take advantage of the monsoon winds. And by the time we get to the 1st century CE, we're hearing reports about this land called Azania. So the Bantu people at this point have established themselves on the East African coast, and they've built these trading towns where they're taking their farming techniques, their cattle raising, their expert mastery of coastal fishing, and they're trading those resources with folks that are coming to Africa from Asia, from the Persian Gulf, and even from parts of North Africa, Egypt, Sudan as well. And this is all written about in an anonymously written Greek text. Even though the text was written in Egypt, in Alexandria, Egypt, it was written in Greek because that was the lingua franca of the time. And it's called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, or The Travels in the Indian Sea is what this is called. And it talks about these towns. This book by Robert O. Collins, Documents from the African Past, is another great little book that you could have in your collection, where it has a number of primary sources from different travelers, writers, explorers who came to Africa throughout the centuries. And one of the first documents in this book is a translation of this text, which talks about the people in Azania. And I'll just read a little bit of it. The anonymous writer writes, "The men of great stature inhabit the whole coast, and at each place they've set up chiefs. The people of Mazua hold it in tribute under the sovereignty of one of these chiefs. And they are small ships with mostly Arab captives and crews who trade and intermarry with the mainlanders of all the places and know their language." This is the beginnings of the Swahili city coast. You got Bantu folks who have set up these areas, these trading cities, and travelers, Arab travelers, Indonesian travelers, Chinese travelers, Indian travelers, all making their way to the coast, intermarrying, exchanging cultures. But the basis of all of this is a Bantu culture. Swahili is a Bantu language. So it's a language that shares similarities with people all the way on the other side and further north in Africa, Nigeria and Cameroon. So very important. In those market towns are imported lances made especially for them, hatchets, swords, axes, and many kinds of small glass vessels. In some places, wine, and not a little wheat, not for trade, but to gain the goodwill of, and the writer, of course, shows the ethnocentricity of the barbarians. So he calls the people barbarians. Much ivory is taken away from these places, but it is inferior to quality to that of Adulis, which is in Ethiopia. So it's saying Ethiopian ivory is a better quality. And also rhinoceros horn, tortoise shells, different from that of India, and a little coconut oil. And these, I think, are the last of the market towns of Azania. So when you hear the name Azania, this is where it comes from. This was a name actually taken by revolutionaries in South Africa for what they wanted South Africa to be called after apartheid, which was Azania. So you have the Pan-African Congress of Azania, the Azanian People's Liberation Army, so on and so forth. It's one of the very early names associated with this. From this name, we're also going to get the key term Zanj, which we'll talk about in a second. All right, so this is another example of what was going on in the rest of Africa at this time. And we're talking about that place you see there in the orange. And again, another representation of where these city-states were. The trade that was going on, like was mentioned, we know about, this is a good image to look at. So you can see that the ancient world, so we're talking about the early centuries of the first millennia. So the 100s, the 200s, the 300s, the 400s, the 500s, all of this trade is going on. People did not sit still in ancient times. People are going from Malaysia and Indonesia into the East African coast. You see Thailand and China. All of this is based off of the monsoon winds that carry. Let me see if I have I don't have an image of that. But every year, there is a circular pattern of monsoon winds that take people to Africa, and then ultimately from November to February, those winds take people to Africa. And then from April to October, those winds take you to Asia. So you can catch those winds, get to Africa, do your trading, take a rest, then get the winds and can go back home. So this was a highway and a perfect location for these African city-states to grow rich off of the control of this trade going in and out of Africa. An example of some of these cities, we know this from the archaeological record. This is one of the ancient Swahili city-states in Kenya, in southern Kenya. This is the Getty site, where you see buildings were constructed. We know from this site the type of goods that were exchanged between people. We know about social hierarchy from the archaeological records. Some people were living well, the chiefs and the people of power, and then some people were servants and different things. So we can see that in their graves and the things that they left behind. Again, these are the sources that we have. From the archaeological record, we know what was exported to the rest of the world. Gold, very important. It's going to become even more important as the centuries go on. Ivory, of course, elephant ivory, rhinoceros horns, all these things. Going to China, especially. China had a thirst for ivory, for various things that they did. Tortoise shells, copper, iron, animal skins, live animals. There was a trade in live animals. And ambergris, which is fossilized resin from trees that can be used to make perfumes. It was very expensive in ancient times, and even today. Africans were importing porcelain from China, beads from India, cloth, ointments, perfumes, oils, silk from the great Silk Road trade that was happening in Asia. And we found all of this in the archaeological record in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Mozambique, and even points further west in Congo, in the Great Lakes region around Burundi and Uganda and Rwanda. We found these items coming from Asia. So this is international trade. One of the most important items coming from Asia at this time actually is the banana. You might think, well, why is a banana so important in all its varieties, plantains and all that? This is going to change things in the Great Lakes region. It's because of the banana that the kingdom of Uganda emerges. We're going to talk about Uganda in a couple of weeks, but something as simple as that can change world history, and it did. So very important time period that we're talking about. So these are the written records that talk about this. Like we already mentioned, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, the Swahili Chronicles, Chinese records talk about East Africa at this time, Arab travelers, of course, Portuguese records, and then the oral history as well. One of the earliest writings about this time period comes from an Arab traveler named Al-Masudi. Al-Masudi writes this great text called Metals of Gold and Mines of Gems, where he talks about the East African coast. And he's writing around the year 900. And he talks about, just like we saw in the Periplus, he talks about the makeup of these city-states, how they were organized, the types of trade that they were engaged in. And he actually traveled there. A lot of these Arab travelers wrote about their travels. They didn't actually travel anywhere. They based it off secondary accounts. But he actually went from his hometown in Baghdad, in modern-day Iraq, to the East African coast. And he saw the interactions. And then he noted that, oh, yeah, one of these city-states was actually run by a Muslim, which means at the time, 900, most of these city-states weren't run by Arabs. They were still under control of the Bantu people. And the Bantu people still held on to their traditional religious beliefs. It's going to take a while before Islam becomes the main religion and the main organizing principle. And then people are going to start changing their genealogies. And this becomes really interesting along the Swahili city coast, because people, when Islam becomes such a strong dominating religious force, and then the Arabs become such a strong political force, people start changing their genealogies. Chiefs, instead of saying that they're Bantu, start to say that, oh yeah, my ancestors were a companion of the prophet, or we were Persian. Even to this day, in 2023, you can find people in Tanzania, in Kenya, in Mozambique, that will say that their ancestors came from Persia. Now, the archaeological record, the oral history doesn't support any of that. I mean, the written record, but that has become part of the narrative because of the dominance of the Arab presence in this region. But Al-Masudi, who's writing at the time in 900, was like, nah, there's only one chieftain that's a Muslim. Everybody else is practicing their traditional religion. He talks about the peace of the place. Not a lot of conflict. People are about their business. They're about making money. This is one of the international centers of economic activity in the world. So all these goods coming in, the chiefs are making sure that the people that live in the towns are taken care of. They're making sure that the travelers that come into the towns are taken care of. They had not COVID restrictions, but they had restrictions back in the day. You couldn't just come into these cities. If you were a traveler coming from India, coming from China, and it wasn't because, again, they weren't prejudiced against Chinese people. They were prejudiced against anybody coming in because they said you might have disease. So instead of us opening up the town for you to just come in and bring all your germs, you got to quarantine for a while. Once we realize you're not sick, then you can come into the towns. They had a whole islands just for people to stay, and so that we could figure out if you're sick or not. Because Africans weren't going to do what Europeans did. Europeans just let everybody come in. That's how they got the Black Death and the bubonic plague in their ports in Venice and all these other places. No. You got to stay here, quarantine, then we'll allow you to come in and trade. But they took care of the people. It was safe. One thing that the Arab travelers that go throughout Africa during this time, in the early centuries of the first millennium, they all write about the safety, about the cleanliness of the cities, about the piety of the people, how much they believed in their spirituality, and how much they interacted with each other on a peaceful level. So that's very important to note. And Al-Masudi talks about all of this in this book. All right. Then we got the Chinese that talk about East Africa and the magical animals that came out of East Africa. This is from one of the Chinese records, probably from the later travels of Admiral Xing Ho, who brought back giraffes to China. You imagine you've never seen a giraffe before. You would think it was magical too. If you never saw the giraffe, you've never seen a picture of one, and if somebody brings this animal that looks like this with the little horns and so, you would think it's magical too. So the Chinese talked about the East African trade and the things that came out of East Africa. The last thing I want to talk about before we take a break is the oral history. that recounts this time period, and a very famous story of this transition from a predominantly Bantu culture to one more heavily influenced by Islam and Arab culture. Not that Islam and Arab culture took over completely, but the ruling classes became much more Arabicized, and that was for economic purposes largely. They say, oh well, the Arabs are controlling this region. Maybe I should convert to Islam. I have a better opportunity to engage in some trade, make some money. But then it ultimately became, some people did convert because of a true religious conviction, but then some people converted because they wanted that money. They wanted that business relationship. So this tale, the tale of Fumo Liyongo Wabaori, is one of the most well-known tales of this region. He's like the African Robin Hood, as they say. I hate to compare Africans to Europeans. He's more like the Swahili. He's more like the Swahili Sundiata. There's a lot of epic tales in Africa of rulers who use their wit and their strength and their colleagues to assist them in, fulfilling their missions. He is the East African Sundiata. So Fumo Liyongo Wabaori. Scholars aren't sure when this poet, this potential ruler of the Pate Kingdom, actually lived. It was at the 800s, the 900s, or was it sometime closer in the 13th century, or up until even the 1600s? People are debating this. But what the tale does show us is this transition between the Bantu culture and an Arab-dominated culture. So the poem, the oral history about him, also contains poems that are ascribed to him, that he wrote about himself. So this is a black man. While he's doing all these feats, he's also rhyming. He's writing these poems about himself and his exploits. So Fumo Liyongo is a great character. But he was supposed to inherit one of the kingdoms on the Swahili City coast. And this is one of the examples of the cultural transition. He had a cousin named Daudi. Now, Daoud was the son of the previous ruler. But if you know about Bantu traditions throughout Africa, it's not usually the direct son of the king that takes over. It's usually the king's sister's son, because it's a matrilineal succession. The king had to be related to the royal family through the mother. You see that throughout West Africa, Central Africa, and parts of East Africa. However, somehow Daoudi colluded with the Arab traders that were in the region and others. He had converted to Islam, and he was able to usurp the throne from his cousin, who was the rightful heir of the throne, because he was related to the king through the king's sister. Daoudi wasn't content with just being the king. He knew the popularity of Fumo Liyongo, and we know from the oral history, from the epic, and from what Fumo Liyongo said about himself in his poems, that he was a handsome guy, he was a tall guy, he was fit, people loved his charisma, he could talk, he could fight, he could do all these things. And of course, we have to say, okay, how much of this is people writing about him and how much is him writing about himself? But anyway, he was enough of a threat to his cousin that his cousin wanted him dead. First, his cousin tried to exile him. Then his cousin tried to kill him in all these different ways, using different people to try to kill him. He tried to get the Twa people to kill him. He married him to an Oromo woman. So we're seeing this Pan-African story. You got the Twa people come in, you got the Oromo people who are in Kenya and also in Ethiopia. He's bringing them into the conversation. Then he tries to get his cousin's new in-laws to kill him. None of these things work. Finally, he's able to arrest Fumo Liyongo. And this is the great part of the story. And this is where this takes place, near the Tana Delta in southern Kenya. Fumo Liyongo's Prison Break is one of the most well-known epics in East Africa. So Fumo Liyongo gets arrested, and he said he knows his cousin's going to kill him, and he tells his cousin, "Look, I know I'm going to die, but before you kill me, I need one thing. Please throw a party for me outside of the prison walls. That way, before I'm executed, I can just hear the music and the people partying one more time before I die." And the cousin says, "Okay, I'll honor that." While all this is going on, while he's locked up, though, he has told his mother's maid that the mother should bake him a cake with a file in it so that he could start breaking his chains. And the mother is doing this because she was baking him cakes, but the guards were eating the cakes. So he said, make it an ugly cake this time, so that way that the guards won't eat it and they'll let me actually have the cake. So she bakes him this ugly cake with the file in it. He gets it, but he can't start scratching at his chains without the guards hearing him. So when the party is going on and they're drumming and the people are singing, because they love Fumo Leongo, they know he's unjustly locked up, about to be executed by his cousin. They're singing, they're dancing. He's in there and breaking his chains, but the guards can't hear it because of all the music. And then while the people are partying, all of a sudden they turn around and Fumo Leongo is among them, and he's dancing and singing. And before the guards can get him, he's off and runs away. It's not until Daudi is able to convince Fumo Leongo's son, with his Oromo wife, to turn his back on his father and find the secret to Fumo Leongo's mortality. How do you kill Fumo Leongo? And his son actually stabs him with I think it's a copper dagger. And his father's like, why have you done this to me, son? Blah, 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 blah. It's a whole thing. It's an epic tale. But anyway, it shows the transition. It's more than just Fumo Leongo. It shows the transition from Fumo Leongo, who represents the Bantu culture and Bantu philosophy, to this emerging African Arab culture that's going to dominate the Swahili City coast in the, at least the last centuries of CE, the first millennium. So up into the 1500s. And then there's another group that comes in, the Portuguese, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So let's take a break very quickly before we talk about other things going on in other parts of Africa at this time. So let's take a break and go to any questions. So Nana, are there any hands up or is there any questions in the chat? And if you're talking, you're on mute. I'm not sure if she... Nana, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay. Anything in the chat or are there any hands?
Yes, Renford Thomas.
Hello, are you Kragona?
Yes, sir.
Yes, you can.
Hello, morning again. Happy New Year to all. It bothers me, and I'm wondering, the more I attend these courses, the more frustrated I get. When you listen to the trade and the resistance, so on and so forth, and yet we seem to be able to fall back and focus on the slave portion of our history. And that's what seems to dominate us. And I'm trying to figure out, was it so ingrained, so dominant, so brutal that we just can't let go of that?
Yeah, I think it's two things with that. Slavery is something that should be talked about, and it should never be forgotten. The same way that the Holocaust is, that the slogan for the Holocaust is never forget. Slavery is something that we should never forget. We should never forget colonialism either. But it's important for us to remember that that's only the last 500 years of our 5,000 years of recorded African history. Not all of African history, just recorded African history. So it's only 1/10 of our history. 9/10 of it don't involve slavery and colonialism, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to start the day with this African conversation. We're all going to talk about enslavement today, but even when you do talk about enslavement, you have to talk about resistance as well, which is another thing that we don't do. But the focus primarily on enslavement, particularly in the Americas, and particularly in U.S. and Canada, it is disheartening. And it's why I try, especially when I talk to young people, is to never start with that. Because that's not the beginnings of our history, and that's not the dominant portion of our history. It's something to be remembered, it's something to study, but it's not the end-all, be-all of our history. It's like a human life. We go through different things in our lives, but we don't focus on the bad things. We look at them, we study them to make sure that they don't happen again, and to figure out the resilience and the ways that we resisted those things. But there's so many other things, aspects in our lives that have occurred that we focus on. Same thing with the history of a people. So yeah, I understand. I share your frustration because yeah, that is the conversation that comes up a lot. And when we get to February, that will be one of the main things in the conversation. And I hate that because slavery is often talked about without resistance as well. So you get this almost history of, yeah, black people were enslaved and they were tortured and they were beaten. But then one day, slavery was over and black people should be happy that it's over and they should be making progress ever since. Yeah, no, that's not the best way to teach history. It's not, it's a destructive way to teach history. And you got to think about the black children in class where February might be the only month that they actually even get the history talked about. And you're going to talk about the most tragic moment of their history. You know, that's like, you know, your favorite sports team. You only talk about the time that they lost the big game. What about all the victories they had? Like, I'm from Pittsburgh. The Steelers have won 6 Super Bowls. I don't talk about the Super Bowl from 1996 that they lost to Dallas. I don't want nobody bringing that up. No, let's talk about the ones that we won. So that's, I share your frustration. That's what these classes are trying to alleviate. So yes, thank you for that comment. Right.
Follow up to that,
Yes, sir.
The fact that, for instance, we take Haiti, and just about all the superpowers at one time or another invaded Haiti, and yet we seem to look to the oppressors for relief.
Yeah.
That also creates a problem.
That it does. Again, this is another one of those things. If we knew history, then we would know what's going on in Haiti right now and the interference from the West that caused a lot of this. See, without knowing history, you would think that Haiti is just a lost cause, just a place of chaos, and that the West has to constantly come in and save Haiti, not realizing that the West is part of the reason why Haiti's in the chaos that it's in and supports this and keeps it chaotic so that it can keep exploiting Haiti. So you have to know that history. And in fact, again, connected to what I talked about earlier, if you really want to honor Dr. King, you should be out protesting Western interference in Haiti because King would be protesting that. We would be out protesting AFRICOM, the U.S. African Command that has military bases all over Africa. King would have been against that. So all of these things are important for us to know, to connect history to the contemporary period, because without knowing the history, you'll look at these contemporary struggles and events and just believe the narrative that is given without all the background. You'll believe that Canada is somehow as benevolent power to Haiti, to parts of Africa, without realizing that, hey, wait a minute, Canada had a role in Patrice Lumumba's assassination. Canada had a role in the abduction of Aristide. Canada had a role in this, that, and the third, and you start thinking, wait a minute, how can you come and save, well, at the same time, you are partially the cause? And what about these businesses that are operating? So all of this is important for us to remember. So thank you for that. Nana, anything in the chat? Any questions in the chat that folks wanted me to address? Sure. Let me check on this one. Okay, just think some stuff from the slide. All right. So this is just some conversation about the slide. So let's get back into it. Well, any other questions or people? We'll get back into it. We'll get into it. Okay, no, I'll take Mr. Francis. Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Morning, and as Mr. Thomas said, Happy New Year. The only comment I want to make, sir, is that so many Western countries appear to be giving aid to African countries. And I think it's so laughable. Because on the one hand, they're offering pittance, but behind your back, they are taking out so much of the country. But yet, Ron, it's a public relation campaign that they have on, where you see things like religious organizations and NGOs are handing out like parcels of food to Africans, and they're not mentioning the fact that so much of the natural resources of the country is being drained by those same people who are handing out gifts to them.
Yes, sir. I can't say it any better. That's you're right. That's what we have going on, and it's for classes like this that we could constantly remind what happened, so that we're not fooled by these types of things as they occur. All right, so let's. So we're going to move in a northeastern direction from the Swahili city states up to the Horn of Africa and Sudan. We talked about the emergence of Islam and the Arab Empire that was resulting of the Arabs being unified under Islam in the 600s and then the 700s. Because prior to this, the Arabs were busy fighting themselves and other things. So Islam united them and they became a force. And ultimately, by the time we get to the 900s, the 1000, the 1100s, we start to see that transition in East Africa. But it had already started in Northeast Africa in some places, as well as making its way into North and Northwest Africa. So we see from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, there was no Arab Empire. This region, we already talked about this in part one, but it's worth going over. This region was controlled by the Romans and the Persians. They weren't even concerned about the Arabs because the Arabs were too busy fighting themselves. Once they're united by Islam, they bust out of the Arabian Peninsula. They take over all of these lands till we eventually get this, where the Arabs are in control of much of this region. We talked about in our Shiro's class, as well as in part one, when the Arabs made their way into North Africa, they came up against the opposition of Dahia al-Kahina, who was the female leader of the Amazigh, of the Berbers in North Africa around Algeria and Tunisia, who put up spirited resistance against the Arabs. She was ultimately defeated, and much of her forces and other North African and Northwest Africans converted to Islam, some out of religious conviction, but others because they didn't want to pay the tax. So the Arabs were smart. The Arabs were about creating an empire. Converting people to Islam was secondary. So this is not, we shouldn't call it an Islamic empire, even though it was a caliphate. It was controlled by the descendants of the successors of the Prophet, but it was really an Arab empire. It was an empire like any other empire, just happened to be Islamic. So when this occurs, if you just convert people to Islam, you can't exploit them as much. Because there's only so, according to the Quran, there's certain things you can't do to Muslims, other Muslims. You're not supposed to kill other Muslims. You're not supposed to enslave other Muslims. But if the people aren't Muslim, then you can enslave them, you can kill them, you can do different things. And more importantly, if they're not Muslim, if you control the area, you can force these people to pay a tax to practice their religion. So it's a slick form of religious tolerance. Like, well, you will be tolerant to your religion, but you got to pay a tax if you want to practice your religion, whether it's Christianity, whether it's Judaism, whether it's traditional African religion. You got to pay a tax. And then that tax money helped to bring more wealth into the Arab Empire. So again, they weren't interested in automatically converting people to Islam. They'd rather you stay, practice your religion, and pay the tax. But some Africans got hip to this and said, well, I'll just convert to Islam, even if it's just nominally, and I'll practice whatever I want to practice behind closed doors, which created these various versions of Islam throughout West and North Africa that are a little bit different than the Sunni and even the Shia Islam practiced in the East. So by the time the Arab armies are about to take over Al-Andalus, or take over what was now Portugal and Spain, that army is primarily African. That army is primarily African. So this army that crosses the Mediterranean, right here, where Africa and Europe almost kiss, and right now we call this the Straits of Gibraltar, which is named after General Tariq, the Northwest African general who led the troops to take over Spain and Portugal. These troops and the people that came along with them, again, mostly North and Northwest African, became known in Europe as the Moors. The Moors. A lot of the generals, a lot of the leaders were Arabs, but most of the troops, most of the people that were there were North and Northwest Africans. And when these Moors came into, and they were mostly Amazigh, So they were Berbers. They were people from what's now Mauritania, some from even as far south as Senegal. These are the people that took over Spain and Portugal in 711. We already talked about Alcina. So this is Al-Andalus, and they named the place Al-Andalus. So this area used to be a part of the Roman Empire. We've talked in previous classes about, Hannibal's armies being in Spain, but this is the time period from 711 to 1492 that these Africans and Arabs controlled Europe. It's something that's not talked about a lot. The Moors in Europe changed European history because they brought so many things into Western Europe. Now, this time period that they controlled Europe, for a lot of this time period, historians used to call this Europe's Dark Ages. These were the Middle Ages. This is after the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire in the West fell, they say usually around 500 CE. It's still pretty strong in the East. That's the Byzantine Roman Empire. But in the West, in France and Spain and Britain, the Roman Empire has pretty much collapsed. The learning that was associated with the Roman Empire, which had built off the foundations of the Greeks, a lot of that stuff went away. A lot of superstitions came back into practice. A lot of things, really anti-scientific time period, right before Europe had its Renaissance. It's rebirth. Renaissance means rebirth. In Italy and in other places, the Moors were responsible for holding on to a lot of that knowledge about Greek philosophy, about science, about different things that the Europeans in Western Europe were forsaking at the time. And it wouldn't be until the Renaissance that they reconnected with that stuff. It was the Moors that taught in their universities in Spain and in Portugal Greek philosophy, Arab philosophy, African philosophy. They taught science, they taught mathematics, Islamic law. They practiced religious tolerance in Spain and Portugal. They didn't have as heavy as attacks as they had in other places. So Christians could still practice, Muslims could practice, Jews could practice. And there were a lot of Jewish people in Spain and Portugal at this time. So this is just a statue of General Tariq, who Gibraltar is named after. You see the Rock of Gibraltar there. So education, architecture. If you go to Spain today, you can see the architecture of the Moors, who used the know-how of the Africans with the techniques of the Arabs. So the Moors were able to connect knowledge that was coming all the way from Persia, all the way through the learning centers in Alexandria, and even connected, you don't see it on this map, but further south to the University of Sankore at the city of Timbuktu in the Mali and the Songhai empires in West Africa. They were able to take all of this knowledge and bring it into Europe, in the universities where European scholars study and learn from the Moors. Like I said, religious tolerance, engineering, new crops were grown in Spain and Portugal. So this was a 700-year period where Africans controlled Europe. Well, a part of Europe, part of Western Europe. Very important, because when they're kicked out in 1492, completely, January 1st, 1492, the Moors and this is a gradual process of the reconquering of Europe, the Reconquista. And then we see all types of brutality come out of Spain at this time. This is when the Inquisition happens, after they retake over from the Moors. And they expelled Jews out of Spain and forced people to convert to Christianity. They kick all the Muslims out. And then they start exploring the places that the Moors told them about. So the Portuguese are out of the Moors' control first. And then they start exploring West Africa because all the things that the Moors had told them about the gold in West Africa and these cities of gold in these places. They start exploring the ocean the way that the Moors had taught them how to navigate the stars and all of these things. So a lot of great Moorish contributions that ultimately come back to bite Africa in the butt in these decades following. They take the technology of the Moors, they take the maps of the Moors, all these things, and then we started seeing enslavement and things happen. We'll get into that a little bit later. But this is a great time period to study, the Moors in Al-Andalus. So while this is happening in the West, and Africans and Arabs are in control of Spain and Portugal, at the same time, Africans are being enslaved in the Persian Gulf. And these Africans are coming from East Africa. So We're going to talk about slavery, but we're not talking about the slavery to the West. We're talking about slavery to the East, because as the Arabs were united under Islam and this empire grows, Africans start to be imported to the West, to Persia, to India, and even as far east as Japan. But primarily what we're going to talk about today is the Persian Gulf, this area of modern day Iraq and Iran. And this is an area where Africans were taken to from East Africa. And it's a better map here. And you see this town here, right here. This area, right where the Persian Gulf meets and the Tigris and Euphrates split, this is where in southern Iraq, and today, there is an Afro-Iraqi population based off of the people that were brought here in the 800s, the 700s and the 800s. Very important. One of the most important African scholars that emerged in this period, who wasn't a slave, his parents might have been enslaved, and he possibly was from either Somalia or Ethiopia or possibly even Kenya, but he was a Zanj. He was from East Africa. Zanj is what the Arabs called East Africa, south of Sudan. So again, it goes back to that word Azania. So Zanj or Zinj. Uthman Emir ibn Bahir, also known as Al-Jahiz. Al-Jahiz means googly-eyed because he had a condition where his eyes kind of like shot out. But he was a genius, a multi-genius. He grew up in Basra, in southern Iraq. But like I said, his family was from East Africa. He was a scholar. He was responsible for educating a lot of the children of the wealthy Arabs in the Persian Gulf. And he wrote a number of books. And one of his books he writes is called The Book of the Glory of the Black Race. Because all the way back in the 700s and in the 800s, because of the trade in Africans to the Persian Gulf, Arabs had developed a superiority complex bordering on racism. Actually, we could call it racism. But they would write all these things about East Africans, how they looked, how they smelled, their lack of intelligence, all these different things, staples that we would find in future iterations of anti-Black racism. But he writes this book and he dispels all of that. He says, I'm Zanj. I'm a man of intellect. My brothers and sisters that I know that are Zanj are of great intellect. We're great poets. We're great scholars. We're good-looking people. He writes all of this stuff to refute Arab racism all the way back in the 9th century. He also writes another book, another very important, called The Book of Animals, which you might think, okay, why is that important? It's just about the Book of Animals. He writes this book in the 800s. The 800s, thousands of years, 1,000 years before Charles Darwin. And in this book, he talks about a theory of evolution, of how certain animals have to adapt to the environments that they're in, and then that adaptation takes on the certain physical characteristics to help them survive in the places that they live. This was an idea that Darwin would have 1,000 years later become famous off of, but it was talked about by this African man in southern Iraq in the 800s, as opposed to the 1800s, in his Book of Animals. So he was a multi-genius, and he actually dies in 868. Very important year. He dies right before one of the most important events happens in this region. Because remember I said, when we talk about enslavement, we have to talk about resistance. So when the Africans were brought to Basra, and this is a good book that talks about everything I'm talking about, the revolt of the African slaves in Iraq. Because a lot of people don't know this story. They don't know that one of the largest successful revolts against enslavement happened not in the Americas, it happened in Iraq. And there were millions of Africans that were taken to Iraq. So at this time, what the Arabs were trying to do, they were trying to irrigate this part of southern Iraq. And it was a big project because in this marsh, the area is where the rivers meet, the Tigris and Euphrates meet, and there's all these other areas, and it's very covered with marshes, and there's a layer above the soil. Before you can farm on the soil, you have to get rid of this thick layer of nitrates, like salt, and you can't grow anything in it. So you have to remove that, and then once you remove that, the area becomes very fertile. You can grow different crops, is a great area for agricultural development. But the hard labor is removing that nitrate. And the Arabs didn't want to do it, so they said, we got to get some enslaved people. So that's when they go to East Africa and to those Swahili city-states, and they start asking for labor. And this is when the slave trade begins. And a lot of the newly Arabized chieftains of the Swahili city-states are now the people like Daudi, who Fumo Liyongo was fighting against. He's the one that's working with these Arabs from the Persian Gulf and these Persians, because they're not all Arabs, some of them are Persians, who are looking for slave labor. Because of this, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Africans go to southern Iraq and enslaved in that regard. During the nitrate, a lot of women are enslaved. In fact, this slavery that's going to the West, that's going to continue. So it's going to stop in Iraq, but it's still going to continue to places like India and Persia and Arabia and Turkey, of course. Much of this slavery was sexual slavery. The slavery that went to the West, the plantation slavery, and the thing that we're most familiar with, you have more men that went to the West. This slavery, 2/3 of the sexual slavery, concubineship. A lot of people in this region of the world had harems where they would, have Ethiopian women, Somali women, Kenyan women, and sex slavery. A lot of the men were actually enslaved and sexualized in a different way. They became eunuchs, where their job was to guard these harems of these great sultans and rulers in Asia and in parts of Europe. And these men would have their testicles castrated so that they couldn't copulate with the women in the harem. But we'll get into that in a couple of weeks, because those men become incredibly important political figures. It's very strange how that happens, but it does. But in the case of Basra, this is very much like plantation-style slavery. So a lot of men, there are some women that are enslaved for domestic purposes, but mostly men that have been taken to Basra. This book by Popovich is one of the only English texts that talks about this revolt, the revolt of African slaves in Iraq. It's called the Zand's Rebellion. And ultimately, because of the backbreaking labor, the brutality of the labor, the Africans organized. And they also organized with a guy that was from India, who was also a servant there. So this was a multiracial uprising, but it was led by the Africans, by the Zand. That's why it's called the Zand's Rebellion. And in 869, they rise up and they slaughter their masters and overseers in southern Iraq. And not only that, they start taking over territory. So it wasn't just about getting free. It's also like, okay, well, let's take over. Let's start our own kingdom, which they did. You see how long this lasted? From 869 to 884, they controlled southern Iraq. They had what would later be called quilombos. They had war camps. They were master strategists of forming defenses. They were ultimately defeated once the folks in northern Iraq got to act together, became stronger, and they actually crushed it. But when they did, when they crushed the Zand's Rebellion, they made a proclamation. They said, we can never let this happen again. No more large-scale importation of Africans. So this stopped this trade of East Africans in large numbers in this region of the world. This is why we don't have a large African diaspora in Iraq and Iran. There is a good-sized one, but it would have been like the West had it not been for the Zand's Rebellion that convinced the Iraqis to say, you know what, this is way too much trouble, getting killed by these Africans, because these are the type of images that people still remember from the Zand's Rebellion. The Africans chopping off people's heads, putting their heads on sticks. I mean, they really did a number on southern Iraq to the point that they said, it's not worth it. We're not enslaving any more Africans. So although, we don't have an African kingdom in southern Iraq anymore, the way that the Zand had created, they were successful in that they stopped Africans from being, imported into Iraq in that way. But that's really the start of the African diaspora in Asia. It's going to continue over the next 1,000 years, but never to the extent of the numbers of Basra. So that's really important. When we come back next week, we're going to talk about, not this, that's way in the future. We're going to talk about other events in Africa. And we're going to go in that counterclockwise direction. We're going to talk about Mali, because this is going to be an example of Africans, again, transitioning from a traditional African base to incorporating elements of Islam. But in the case of Mali, they incorporate Islam, but they don't incorporate Arab culture, which is a different thing, because we have to talk about the separation between Islam and Arab culture. They're not, one emerges from the other, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So when we talk about Mali next week in West Africa, we'll see those differences. And we'll talk about Sundiata Keita. So we talked about Fumo Liongo and the oral history around him. Next week, we'll talk about Sundiata Keita and the oral history around his epic, which is in West Africa. So that's where we'll stop today. We'll open it up to any questions and general discussion and announcements. So before we open up the floor, let me make a couple of announcements. A lot of events will be happening in a few weeks when Black History Month starts. I know Black History Ottawa has a number of events. You can go to their social media pages and their websites to check out what they have going on. As I know they have an opening, I think, on January 28th to celebrate the opening of Black History Month. Jaku Kambit, we are having a number of events. The mentorship program is meeting January 28th at 2:30 at the Bronson Center. So if there's any young people that you know that are looking for work between the ages of 14 and 22, we're having an employment pool. But in order to get into that pool for possible employment with either Jaku Kambit or some of our partners, you need to show up at this meeting so that you can register. And it's also a community build session. So if you're interested in becoming a mentor, you can come out to that meeting. That's January 28th, 2:30 p.m. at the Bronson Center on 211 Bronson Avenue. Today, I think today's the 14th. Yeah, there is a 613 hub meeting at the Bronson Center in room 215. And I'm not sure what time that is, but somebody in the chat may know. So there's a lot of things going on, and all positive, and we'll keep you updated on those events as they come. So let's go into the chat. So I see Robin has his hand up, and Nana, if you could look at the chat and let me know if there's any questions while Robin is talking.
No questions.
Okay, so Robin, go ahead.
Well, first, Happy New Year, man, to
Happy
you and
New
the
Year.
family.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for mentioning the hub meeting. It is 1 o'clock. It is in room 103, the same room that you've used for the mentoring program at the Bronson Center. Yeah, and it's a volunteer recruiting meeting. So, Bacchanal, Black-owned restaurant, is supplying the food like it did last night. So, awesome. Yeah. Your lectures are so great, and they always trigger comments. So, so on the idea of watering down Martin Luther King's memory. So, tomorrow is the annual Dream Keepers event at City Hall. This is an event run by white people, and does very much what you're talking about. It celebrates this kind of watered down version of MLK. None of the radical stuff, right? It all is highlighted, and they give it awards. Awards to people doing good work, but nobody who's doing anything that's really fundamentally challenging the system and causing right. So, yeah, it's like that, right? So, and then I got a personal story, but you mentioned when you're dealing like with legal things, you have to have evidence, right? And I was gonna give a little personal story that shows the inconsistency there in that I've experienced in the system here, right? So, so I'm suing a guy, okay, black guy actually. Okay, I'm suing 2 black guys, and they countersued, which is what happens, right? So in order to so basically this is a small tennis court, okay? So let's sue one guy, he doesn't follow the fence. When that happens, you can then have the person found in default, right? Which means they haven't followed the fence. And then you try to collect. So I was only suing this guy for like $6,000, and I went to the judge, and I had receipts and everything. I had evidence, right? And the judge still said, yeah, not fully convinced. And I gotta admit, I was kind of pleased to see that the seemed the system was set up in a way that you can't easily go against the money. But then get this, the other guy countersued me, and I failed to file the defense just because like I had so many. I literally thought I had filed the defense, but hadn't because I had so many papers on the go. So anyway, so this guy then goes to the judge and makes the case. He said, "Hey, I'm in default. I want him to give me $35,000." The judge says, "Yeah, okay." So this guy, and I know the guy has no evidence. He has no evidence based on the law, and certainly nothing to justify the $35,000. But just to let you know, so right now this guy has a legal decision. Right? Like I came home to the documents that where he's going to try to garnish my wages and send the sheriff to take shifts. So anyway, don't worry, I've got that covered. But it's again an example of how the system, you're supposed to have evidence, but in some cases, no. Right? So it's like, wow. So that, all to say, the reason how that relates to the hub is I'm actually going to file a complaint after my personal stuff is over. I'm going to file a complaint on behalf of the hub with the Attorney General of Ontario because this guy being able to do this, he's got a blackout. I'm thinking, oh my God, like white people could totally use this against black people. You can just create a lawsuit and then if for some reason the black person doesn't file the defense, and you can just go and make up any bullshit and say, yeah, file me $55,000. It's incredibly dangerous, right? So, so I'm gonna after this is over, I'm gonna file that complaint with the Attorney General of Ontario about this whole problem with the system.
Okay, keep us updated, definitely. Any other questions or comments or announcements, events, things going on in the community that folks want us to know about before we close out? Any questions, comments, final things? I don't see any. All right, so next week we will reconvene. So everybody stay well, and we'll talk soon.